Hello and welcome to APUS History Mindset, Lesson 1.3, The Age of Salutary Neglect, taking place from 1607 to 1763, roughly. We will be looking at British colonial policy and its effects, along with major events that took place during this time period. So, what was salutary neglect? Salutary neglect was this unofficial British policy of loosely enforcing colonial laws, especially pertaining to trade regulations. Because of the distance between England and America, England set up these absentee customs officials, and these colonies were left to self-govern themselves. England hardly interfered with anything as long as the American colonies continued to make money through trade. So this allowed colonies to develop economic and political autonomy. You could think of this period as when the colonies grew up and developed their own economies. And this is also where an American culture began to take root. So some of the causes of salutary neglect. Part of it was that Britain was preoccupied with the various wars and other conflicts that were happening in Europe, that they didn't have as much time to worry about all the colonies across the sea. And since colonial trade was still contributing to the British wealth, even with some smuggling and some other illicit activities, they continued to turn their back since they were still making money. And the obvious one, distance and a lack of resources made strict enforcement difficult. They didn't have any way of efficiently communicating. Some communication could take months. So some of the effects on the colonies include their, again, as I mentioned, growing of self-government, growing of their own economies, having prosperity of those economies, again, through trade, including smuggling. And the colonists gained experience in self-rule, which did later fuel resistance when Britain attempted to reassert control after the French and Indian War. So the end of salutary neglect. This ended after the French and Indian War, as I mentioned. Britain needed to pay war debts and figured the best way to do this would be to start imposing taxes that they never had imposed before on the American colonies. Obviously, since the colonists were so used to this autonomy, they resisted these taxes, and this led to growing tensions between the colonies and Britain, which eventually led to the American Revolution. We'll also look at some of the other key events that aren't necessarily tied to salutary neglect, such as the slave trade, which I talked about in the previous one, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but institutionalized slavery did begin in the English colonies during this time. Bacon's Rebellion happened, which was a major uprising in Virginia that highlighted tensions between the poor settlers and colonial elites. So Bacon's Rebellion was Western settlers and farmers. They resisted against the Native Americans, since the Native American land, they wanted. This was led by Nathaniel Bacon, which is where, the name comes from. The Salem witch trials, which you may have heard of, also happened during this time, and this was simply mass hysteria in Massachusetts, which led to the execution of about 20 people. And these were not the first witch trials in New England, just keep that in mind. The first 70 years of English settlement in the region, there was about 103 people, which, again, were almost all women, were tried for charges of witchcraft. But during 1692, many of these witches were executed. This was the most significant witchcraft hysteria. So in the 1730s and 40s, the First Great Awakening also happened, which is going to become a lot more significant later on in the course, as once we begin talking about the development of a religious identity, This is where we will look back. This was a religious revival movement that emphasized their personal faith and challenged established churches. There are a lot of key figures that we'll talk about, especially Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Those were the two main figures of that time period. So this, the First Great Awakening was this kind of response to the Enlightenment, which if you have taken any kind of world history course, which you should have at this point, that was a European intellectual movement pertaining to ancient philosophy, rationalism over emotionalism, and spirituality. The final major event was the Albany Plan of Union, which was Benjamin Franklin's attempt to unite the colonies for defense. However, it was ultimately rejected in the end. So, to review here, key points include that salutary neglect allowed the colonies to grow politically and economically. Its end led to increasing colonial resentment towards British rule, and it helped sow the seeds of revolution. By letting the colonies govern themselves for so long, Britain unknowingly encouraged their desire for independence, leading to the American Revolution, and essentially where we are today. That ends the first unit of APUSH History Mindset. I'll see you for Unit 2.